Okay, I'm going to take a moment to explain what has happened in Salt Rock, Ballito with regards to running short-term rentals, Airbnbs, and the municipality, which is called Quadakuza Municipality, shortened to KDM. So on the 20th of June, myself, as in a property that I run in Salt Rock using a rental arbitrage strategy, was blitzed. What that means is a team of people, a team of officials arrived to do an inspection using the language, this is a blitz operation, to have a look at the property. They said they were responding to a complaint. And I must say my initial reaction was no problem, go have a look. I was certain they were going to be satisfied with what they looked at and leave. But I was wrong. What actually happened is they left a whole bunch of documents behind saying that you needed a special business license to operate as a short-term rental, a self-catering short-term rental, and that you needed to be zoned commercial electricity and commercial rates and potentially require rezoning to operate as a guest house. I made a point of explaining to the officials who were there that day that I was not running a guest house and went into some detail about my understanding of the definitions that I had already found in the bylaws between a guest house and a self-catering short-term rental, but nevertheless was left behind with those documents and told that I need to formally respond within 7 days. So that sent me on quite a big quest to really get my ducks in a row around what is currently in the bylaws. So bylaws are the official laws that are in place for a municipality that they have the right to enforce. And I could tell from the interaction that we had already had during the Blitz, the inspection, that the definitions were going to become very important. So it was a Friday that happened. I spent some time contacting people who I thought would have access to those bylaws so that I could make triple sure on the definitions. Now, I want to mention at this point that I actually have a short-term rental education business, a global short-term rental education business where I've taught students from Trinidad and Tobago and Spain and Australia and plenty in South Africa how to set up their short-term rentals, starting with Airbnb and progressing all the way to getting direct bookings and their website and their marketing, etc. And because of that, I have at multiple intervals checked what the documentation and bylaws say about running short-term rentals wherever it is that I run short-term rentals. And in my short-term rental career, I've had them in Cape Town and I've had them here in Salt Rock. Because that is one of the common objections that my students give, saying, oh, it's not allowed in my city. So I've made a point of going around looking what is written. Now, on that note, I want to say that naturally, everybody wants to comply. Everybody wants to be legit. Everybody wants to be legal. And all that we can do to comply is to look at what the current documentation that is in place and make sure that we're in alignment with them. So what I discovered was that the definition of a guest house in the current KDM bylaws is quite specific. It makes mention of a kitchen facility, shared dining facilities. It does talk about transient guests. And for that reason, most self-caterings, if not all not most, all self-caterings do not have dining facilities and restaurant facilities by the very nature of the name, which is self-catering. You have to cater for yourself. So I had already seen that in the past before I started operating, but I went on a quest to find them. And during my quest, I reached out to the head of the Chamber of Commerce saying, hey, I thought he might be the first person who had access to them the fastest. I said, won't you send me a copy of the bylaws? And to which I got a surprise response. I got a response saying, hey, I have seen the amendment that's out and I've commented on it. And I thought, what amendment? What are you talking about? And that is how I discovered that the Land Use Management Scheme, LUMS, had a proposed amendment to it, meaning how you can use the land in a residential area or a commercial area. It's basically it ends up going into an official document called SPLUMA, Spatial Planning Land Use Management a something, agreement, association, I'm not sure, but SPLUMA is what is actually in place. And a LUMS amendment is when there's going to be an amendment to what is currently in place. So that came into my awareness through the conversation I had with the head of Chamber of Commerce saying, yes, the Chamber of Commerce has commented on the LUMS amendment. I said, well, what LUMS amendment? And it turns out that during the course of April and May, the KDM municipality had put out for public participation an amendment to LUMS. And one of the components inside there was that there would become a self-catering category and it would require special consent. So then I suddenly had two issues on my plate. Since I have a short-term rental education business, I had the issue of a consent requirement coming into place and about to go to council to get passed, that nobody in the short-term rental in the neighborhood, that the community in the neighborhood that I live in, or KDM, but specifically we refer to the North Coast or the Dolphin Coast, was aware or participated in that process, that public participation process, which was already closed at the point that I became aware of it. And then two, I had this definitions issue of the current inspection that I had had. So I decided to formally respond to this. I was given 7 days. I sent an email to the address that was left behind on the documentation saying 100% I want to comply. Please show me the bylaw that I am in breach of and what the pathway is to get a business license and to be compliant. So that email got sent off and I turned my attention to find out who was aware of this in the short-term rental community in my neighborhood. And I put together a survey asking what kind of host are you, how many properties do you handle? Do you handle them on behalf of yourself or others? Do you have any certifications, registrations? Were you aware of this process of public participation for the amendment to LUMS? Do you have a business license? What kind of zoning do you have? Basically all around the things that were left behind that day around my own short-term rental. And the results were very in line with my understanding. 99% of people said they had not heard of LUMS amendment for public participation. And of the people who had heard, nobody had participated because they thought it either didn't apply to them or they didn't know how. So not one person in my survey, which represented approximately 400 to 500 short-term rentals across the different hosts who participated, had actually participated in the public participation process. So with that knowledge, I created an emailing list they could join and a WhatsApp update group. And I went about drafting a letter that we could submit on behalf of all of the hosts saying, hey, we weren't aware. This is a very important issue. If it requires consent, we need to be able to participate in what that consent looks like. Does it mean we have to rezone? Does it mean everybody in the street has to agree? Does it mean that there's restrictions on how we can operate? What does it mean? And since we're the industry that's being affected and we employ people and it's our livelihood and it's an important part of this town, which is considered a tourist town, we need to participate. So I sent that letter. Then an organization called the South African Short-Term Rental Association drafted a letter to the same effect and also brought up some points on lack of clarity around what the bylaws are and what the definitions are. It brought up the idea that currently it seems to be silent both nationally and certainly in KDM on the difference between a long-term tenant and a short-term tenant. The usage is the same. It's a family who arrives and baths and eats and sleeps. It's simply the amount of time that varies, that they're staying for 3 days, 3 months, 3 years. So the usage certainly looks residential. Why should it be zoned commercial? It's very different than a guest house or a hotel that has a commercial kitchen and a set of chefs and facilities like a spa and where you can get a massage or your nails done, et cetera, et cetera. So the usage is certainly different, and that was raised, and a request for clarity was asked, and for the public participation process to open again. And then the Ward 22 councillor also made a formal request. And after some time, feedback was given that that specific amendment for consent use for self-catering would be put in abeyance, meaning it would be taken out of that current document that was about to go through council, and a new process would start. So that was good news. That was a victory. However, shortly after, on the 4th of August, myself and a couple of other operators received a prohibition order. Prohibition order that stated you are operating your operation illegally, you need to stop immediately, and you would be subject to punitive rates ×6 because you would be zoned in the category of abandoned and illegal buildings. And that upped the ante. So what we had to do at that point was speak with a lawyer who contacted an advocate who poured through the existing bylaws and drafted a response saying, here's your definition of a guest house that you're accusing us of illegally operating. Here's what we're doing. It doesn't fit that definition. We believe we're doing this, which is a definition we found in a rates document from the past. We noticed that it's no longer a definition in the current rates document, but it does mean that there has been this definition up until now. We believe that if you enforce this prohibition order, it is you who's acting unlawfully, not us. And as it stands of today, which is the end of August, 28th of August, 2025, we are waiting for a formal response on that. We have received acknowledgement of that formal letter, but we have not received a response. So that is the full update on what happened. Now, there's a couple of key issues that I want to raise for you to be aware of if you are in the short-term rental industry. The first one is that there's being on the tip of Africa, being in South Africa, there's some big advantages in that the countries that are very developed tend to be ahead of us. And in this case, major cities tend to have already very firmly regularized, put compliance in place. So for example, this past weekend, I was in Amsterdam. I was curious about what happens in Amsterdam from an Airbnb point of view. And the way that it works in Amsterdam currently is that you can only use an Airbnb or have a short-term rental on your property if you are a resident there. And even if you are a resident there, you can only have the space for 30 nights a year. And you still need to be registered and you need to display the registration number that you are issued on your Airbnb listing. And I went and looked on Airbnb and I saw that any Airbnb listing I found in Amsterdam City, in fact, had the registration number. Whereas in South Africa, we haven't quite got to the point where everybody knows exactly how to comply and what that should look like. There is a white paper out nationally where the Department of Tourism is trying to take the best practice from what has happened internationally and make a set of Africa-specific, South Africa-specific frameworks for municipalities to follow. But that hasn't happened yet. And we've been in the process of doing that since 2019. In the absence of that, municipalities are inventing their own wheel each time. Cape Town currently went through a process of trying to find out what to do, and right now has decided that short-term rental looks more like long-term rental, and it is in fact residential use, and you don't need a license, and you don't need to pay any kind of commercial rates or electricity. So that's a good precedent to follow. And other municipalities have different things in place. Stellenbosch has something similar. If you do for more than 30 nights, I believe that you have to apply for a license. But you are still zoned residential and pay residential rates and electricity. So as you can see, there isn't one uniform approach across South Africa, and KDM, the municipality where I am, is busily wrestling with this. But their current contention is that any accommodation provider, whether you're short-term rental, Airbnb, self-catering, is currently classified as the guest house definition, and that is the point of contention that we are arguing against, because that has quite serious implications. It would mean rezoning, and it would mean commercial electricity, commercial rates, when in fact the usage, in our opinion, and according to our interpretation of the bylaws and the usage, is that the usage is still residential. So that's something for you to think about. Then the next thing for you to think about is that there are other entities that intersect with property usage that you might want to be aware of. And one is the regulatory authority that estate agents need to be registered with, which is the Property Practitioner Regulatory Authority, the PPRA, which which basically says in order to be a property practitioner, you need to be registered with them and you need to have a license and you need to have something called an FFC, Fidelity Fund Certificate, in order to take money on behalf of someone else for their property and to keep a commission and to give them their money. You need to be registered as a property practitioner with an FFC certificate, and that is a process of education and fees that have to happen. And there are many people who believe that you need to be registered with the PPRA and have an FFC in order to run a short-term rental as an agent. Not if you run your own, then you are owner exempt, just like you can sell your own house privately without needing to be an estate agent. But if you want to sell someone else's house, you have to be registered as an estate agent. Now, there seems to be quite a lot of contention around if that's true or not true. And I personally have phoned the PPRA many times, only 2 of which I've got through to someone. And on the first occasion, the person on the call, the end of the line, told me you don't need to be registered with the PPRA in order to run a short-term rental or an Airbnb. They said they are working on something, but currently there isn't anything. And then the people in my community who I told that information to were so surprised. I thought, let me phone back and verify. And on the second occasion, just a few days later, the person who I spoke to that day told me, in fact, you do need to be registered with the PPRA and have an FFC certificate. So even that interaction means that there's a lot of lack of clarity around what it means to run a short-term rental in South Africa and which associations that you might need to be registered with.